Hey everybody, welcome to the 10% True podcast. Quick message from me before you get stuck in. This podcast is free, so there's no advertising. I don't monetize it on YouTube. You don't have to sit through any annoying adverts, and I don't even ask for any money through Patreon. But if you could, in exchange for that, drop me a like, leave a comment, share my content, and if you're listening to the podcast version, maybe leave a review of the channel, that would be hugely appreciated. It will help me to grow my audience, which is really what I'm trying to achieve. Anyway, with that, I'll let you get back to listening. Enjoy. Stinger, welcome back to 10% True. It's been a while. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We obviously have had a couple of conversations. So you talked a bit about your experiences over Syria while you were stationed at Lakenheath as a weapons systems officer in the Strike Eagle. I'll put a link in the description for anybody who hasn't seen that. Go and watch that. But we're going to go back in time for this conversation then and look at your conversion to, from a navigator in the US Air Force to a pilot in your experiences at UPT. And then we'll talk hopefully a bit about what it's like to fly the Strike Eagle from the front seat. That wasn't a question, that was a statement. So I don't know why I paused there. So what was your, because you were already a pilot, so you had a commercial license, you'd flown jets, for a friend of yours who owns some. What was it like then going to UPT and effectively having to start again as far as the Air Force was concerned?
It was definitely an interesting experience. When I was flying civilian-wise, most of my time flying was in a bunch of different types of airplanes, but I was never really good. I wasn't a really great pilot. I think I was always good at bullshitting and weaseling my way into the cockpit of whatever airplane to be able to fly it and stuff and gather some more experience. So when I went to nav school, it was a kind of a hiatus from the front seat or from pilot decision making. You do a little bit of stuff at nav school when it comes to flying a T6, but it's all from the back seat, and it doesn't really build a lot of piloting command decision type making that you need to do, as a pilot in the future. It really focuses on things that are, or skill sets that are important to, being a nav, in whatever airframe, or being a weapons system officer and, a bomber or fighter. So some of the aviation familiarity is still there, but as I went on in the Strike Eagle, I get a chance to fly from the back seat a bunch because there's dual controls there, which is great. But still, you're not really part of the day-to-day front seat operation of that airplane. So I tried to stay current as much as I could by taking flights back to the U.S. and flying, whether it was the L-39 or whatever other aircraft, to try to get the blood flowing as far as a piloting command sort of thing. However, when I went to UPT, it was not really starting over again because I was very familiar and I had quite a few thousand hours of flying civilian, but it was still getting back into the swing of things. And with UPT, the way that they kind of structure the program is you push through a bunch of academics at first, which is a very hardcore concentration within systems, aircraft systems, instruments, and local flying procedures, all that sort of stuff. And then you get into the T6, which is a single engine turboprop. And it's a super fun airplane to fly, and it's super easy to fly. As a matter of fact, it's easier than most civilian aircraft are to fly, based on how it's kind of mech'd within the cockpit. Anyways, did that for a bit, and they concentrate on basic maneuvers and getting a handle on the airplane, and then you gradually go into instruments and being able to fly without referencing anything going on outside, just referencing the instruments in your cockpit, and then you go on to formation, and then where I went to at Shepherd, they have a little emphasis on tactical formations and like low levels as well. So you do a few cross countries, do some low levels, some formation work. It's a lot of fun. And then you transition to the T-38. And the T-38 transition is much more distinct going from the T6 to the T38 based on the performance of the T38. The T38 is overall, it's a pretty easy airplane to fly, but it has some characteristics that will kill you in no time at all. And you've seen some of the accidents that revolve around the T38, and they usually lose a couple a year based on whether it's mechanical error, pilot error. They're really old airframes, and some of the airframes that we were flying were early 60s airframes that had, just tens of thousands of hours on them. So the speeds in which the T-38 flies is very similar to what most fighters fly. So that's kind of why you go there. And the performance is sort of similar. It's a bit more underpowered than most fighters that you go to. But it requires very disciplined pilot decision-making and very deliberate actions and familiarity with systems and instruments and trying to think fast. So all the things that you're doing in the T6 were happening slow, relatively speaking, in the T38. They're essentially the same things, but they're happening much, much faster. So overall, that sort of polishes you through this pilot training program to be able to deal with the speed in which decisions are made in fighters. So to get back to your point of going from the civilian pilot transition to being a WSO to then going to pilot training, some of the speed in which decisions were made and familiarity with formation and instruments and how fighters generally operate, how they fly, was there. Take that back to pilot training, start over again. Now you start to learn all the little details of what it's like to be really in the front seat and how to operate that. So it was a learning process for sure going through UPT. Some of the stuff was already there, but overall, it's filling in all the blanks. It's learning, it's polishing, it's doing all that sort of stuff. And UPT, it has to be very pedantic in the way that it's structured, because you want to try to provide as solid of a baseline as you can for aviators that are going into fighters. So you don't want instructors to gloss over things. It's very, very structured, a lot of rote memorization, and a lot of memorizing numbers and speeds and all this sort of stuff and checklists and everything. That doesn't necessarily build the best decision making because the environment is so structured, if that makes sense. So usually the decision making comes a little bit later on when you go to the fighters, and then you start going through a flight lead upgrade, et cetera, and you start making decisions on your own. Hopefully by that time you've captured enough airmanship to be able to make good decisions from the front seat. So overall, that transition was, I found it to be easy, but frustrating at times, and overall, seemed to work out pretty well. The moving on from the T-38 to IFF, which is Introduction to Fighter Fundamentals, is when you start to learn all the basic fighter maneuvers, how to maneuver the airplane tactically with another airframe, and et cetera. The only interesting thing about IFF is really it's based on a kind of a 1970s syllabus of what is required to make a good fighter pilot. And a lot of people would call those fundamentals, where there's very, very precise formation flying when it comes to being at the right place at the right time. And some of the setups for BFM are super canned, pre-planned choreography. And it mirrors a lot of the initial hacks at fighting that the F-15E model had, which evolved out of some experiences with the F-4, et cetera. So it's not really updated, and it wasn't really getting updated as I was going through. So it's kind of old. So going from a fighter, like kind of a frontline fighter, and having combat experiences, and then going to IFF where there was a lot of pedantic stuff, and most of it had little relevance to modern fighting, or even modern being a modern aviator. And things were so structured that the decision making kind of took a hit. And then they just didn't have really the tactical evolution that you would expect out of that would happen in the fighter world later on. So I thought the IFF could use a little bit of rejuvenation as far as what really matters as a wingman in the CAF and or the Combat Air Force. So that was my only take on that. I mean, all of it was pretty fun, and there were some really good basics that were taught. Like I don't want to short sell that. The way IFF breaks down is that you start off and you do some air-to-air oriented stuff where you do BFM and the like, and then you move to some surface attack stuff where you start to do kind of manual bombing deliveries, and you do strafe, shooting the gun against targets on the ground, and you do some close air support stuff, and then you kind of bring it all together for this finalized sort of sat ride where you do, sort of an ingress picture, and then you are able to attack a target and then run back out. So all that's fine, but it could definitely use a lot more updating. And part of the problem is a function of using the T-38, which is just an old trainer. It's super simple and it's super old, and there's only so much that you can do with it. So that pretty much encompasses all of that up into the B course.
Before you start on that then, Stinger, can you give some examples then of the kind of decision making that you were talking about, and how that differed from the decision making you've been doing as a sort of multi-thousand hour civilian pilot?
So I guess from the commercial side, because I think the military decision making from even the WSO side and even the combat side is a little bit different than the commercial aviation decision making, and a lot of that came from operating in a environment where the circumstances or the context was continually changing. Was kind of a fact of life of the commercial aviation. You were always finding scenarios where you just had to figure it out, and no one was going to hold your hand through the decision making. Whether you had a jet that broke down at an airport with no maintenance facilities, okay, how are you going to figure out what's wrong? How are you going to get it fixed? Or weather making decision when you have somebody who is giving you a paycheck, telling you that you need to press into sketchy conditions. Are you going to do it or not? And then what's your level of comfort as far as weather goes, and how are you going to build experience, and what preventative measures are you going to take, or what compromises are you going to make to be able to accommodate that? And then learning different types of airframes. As a civilian pilot, I flew something like 50 different types of airframes. So in the Air Force, usually you're just, you go through the T6, the T-38, or if you go heavies, you fly the T-1, and then you go into your major weapon system, and then that's it. There's no jumping back and forth between jets. And when we were flying corporate, it was no problem whatsoever to jump between 3 or 4 different jets, and then you had to kind of know what to do with all of them. So what nuances each one had, and all the stuff that was unwritten, that wasn't written in a manual, that you just kind of knew from experience about, okay, this is a better technique to do than this is, or whatever. So in the military, your decisions are pretty clear cut. As a matter of fact, in the Air Force, there's usually a manual for everything that tells you exactly how you're going to make a decision. You know exactly what minimums you're going to go down to based on your experience. Weather minimums. You have a SOF or a supervisor of flying that's going to make an alternate decision for you, or any of that sort of stuff. So a lot of military pilots and a lot of younger military pilots become accustomed to this system that creates this sort of these training wheels, or these decisions that are already made for you and canned, and they reflect best safety practices and all this sort of stuff. So when something happens that's abnormal, or something you wouldn't normally find yourself in, or you would have to make a decision sometimes in the military, then it's kind of roll of the bones whether you're going to make that decision, well, based on all the airmanship that you've accumulated and all the things that you've noticed and everything, or you're going to be kind of the dumb wingman who's not able to make his own decisions and who's relying on somebody else to make them for you. So from a overall flying perspective, I feel like UPT and then IFF didn't do the best job of throwing that out there, and they didn't hold that ability to make those decisions very valuable either. When you go to take a check ride in UPT or whatever, as long as you can do the exact choreography, it's kind of like dancing. If your wife takes you to some, I don't know, dance studio or whatever, and you have to follow this certain lines, that's pretty much, that describes a UPT check ride. It has nothing to do whatsoever with your, true airmanship or ability or decision making. It's just, you go to the airspace that you've been going to ever since you started. You do the maneuvers that you were doing ever since you started. You come back, you do the same approach that you've been doing in instruments that you've ever done, and then you land at the same field you've always landed at, and then you call it good. And even for a lot of fighters, I mean, you come back, you fight in essentially the same airspace that you have been fighting in since you started at the base, and you land at your own airfield. You come back there, so you don't really land at a lot of different places and stuff. And they get a little bit more experience to that with the heavy community, but in the fighter community, it's pretty structured. So from the commercial perspective, there was a lot more of that, a lot more of, hey, no one's going to tell me how to take a temporary registration for an airplane internationally. I'm going to have to go get a flywire from the FAA and figure it out by just understanding how things work, or researching, or calling somebody who's done it before, et cetera, and I'm going to have to be able to figure that out. So that there were a lot of things like that when it came to commercial aviation that I don't feel were emphasized or valued very much within military aviation. So some of the things that would make you a good civilian pilot were not super valued, and nobody really cared in military pilot training. So
did that change then? So when you got to the B course, did that change?
No, the B course is pretty structured as well. You learn the airplane, and to be quite honest with you, there has to be a level of structure, because you're dealing with a $56 million airplane that you've never flown before. So there has to be a level of like a safety net, if you will, of decisions that are, someone can show you, okay, this is how we do it, and this is how we do it to be able to keep you safe. And, oh, by the way, we've invested a lot of money in all these assets that are sitting out on the ramp, and we don't want to lose any. So we'll try to get you good enough to be able to fly and to be able to execute, but we don't really want to take losses so that you have the potential of being better. And that sort of describes the way that the military Air Force works. Now there are certain enclaves where that isn't emphasized as much, and there are certain areas in the Air Force where they will let you get into a lot of trouble on your own, or they'll let you be able to experience and learn a ton. Those opportunities are really kind of far and few between, but they're definitely out there. And we've taken a few of those opportunities, and I've honestly asked myself, like, man, I can't believe I'm actually doing this right now.
There's no
rules
example
against this.
Can you give us an example?
Well, we did not too long ago. We did aerial gunnery with the air-to-air gun, so shooting the air-to-air gun. And we did the setup, and there's a QF-16. So F-16 that's been reclaimed, I guess, if you will, that can either be unmanned or manned, and they're painted orange. Anyways, they have a pod on the wing, and the pod has a 2,000-foot cable attached to it, and there's a little banner on there. And he flies in a circle, and you shoot the gun at him or at the banner, and you do that at 400 knots or so in a turn. So you have to pull a decent amount of lead to be able to do that, or cut across the circle, or however you're going to square it. And this F-16 is in your HUD as you're pulling the trigger, with rounds coming out of your jet air to air, and you do this as your wingman or as your flight lead. Well, they'll do the same thing, and then they'll come off high, and you go back in, and so there's this whole moving chainsaw, so to speak, of your flight lead or your wingman going back and forth, and you're taking shots at this little red tag essentially on the back of this 2,000-foot cable that's being drugged by an F-16 with somebody flying it, a contractor who's flying it. Very brave soul for sure, because you have all these new wingmen that are, anyways, stuff like that. Wow, that's. I mean, it was a lot of fun. Don't get me wrong, but it was one of those things where like, wow, it was great training and great experience overall. But definitely at first glance, you're used to more of a tightly controlled environment. And then that's kind of like, okay, man, it's all up to you. Just don't screw this up, So that was pretty good, I guess. But
so what about then moving from back seat to front seat? Were there things that you thought you knew about operating the aeroplane? Well, maybe you had sort of, and I think we touched on this last time when we talked about, you're sitting in the back and you're thinking, well, maybe I'd do things differently if I were in the front. Were there things that you ended up doing in the front where you thought, actually, now it makes sense that they were doing things that way, or anything that surprised you that you were not expecting?
I tell you what, going in the front seat, I think I have a lot better systems knowledge of the jet than I did when I was in the back seat. And a lot of that stems from interacting with systems on a much more intimate basis, I think, and troubleshooting. Because a lot of the jets, as soon as you start them up, sometimes you have problems, and you have to work through those problems and see what's wrong, and talk to the techs about it, and figure out why your generator keeps falling offline, or while the radar isn't working quite right, or there's flight control codes that you're trying to fix or see or trying to clean up. And I think you develop a little bit more of a corporate knowledge that isn't necessarily in a manual that you can read about on your, on your time off. So interacting with that all the time, I think, gives you a lot better systems knowledge to when you start doing emergencies. Then you can you kind of know exactly what's going on, kind of know exactly what to do, and all that sort of stuff. Which it wasn't that we had a bad knowledge of that in the back seat. It's just that I don't think that we had a very high level, like a very intimate knowledge, or at least I didn't. I'm sure there's WSOs that were out there that did, and WSOs that were a lot better than I was. But yeah, that would be kind of one example of it. Additionally, obviously, when you fight BFM, the front seat, it's extremely difficult to teach BFM or any type of maneuvering from the back seat. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's just without feeling and knowing what the front seat is, what he's seeing, how he's maneuvering the jet, when he's unloading, when he's loading up the jet, when he's actually what cycle of decisions that he's using, or what decision matrix that he's using vis-a-vis the Bandit. It's really tough to know that real time in the back seat for sure. So that was kind of an example of things that were different, and some in a good way, And I also think it kind of goes vice versa as well. for close air support, like pilots I don't think have the level of understanding or detail that WSOs can have when you do close air support, based on the, I don't want to call them secondary tasks, but peripheral tasks to CAS, where it comes to putting the airplane in the right spot, making sure you don't hit anybody else, making sure that the RPA in the stack isn't going to go through your block, or worrying about whether your next tanker plan or whatever, or borders. The WSO can be very, very immersed into the close air support scenario, to where he knows exactly where each person is on the ground, how they're moving, where they're moving to, what they're doing, and collecting all this data and focusing solely on that. So the pilots really don't have that level of detail. And so it's kind of vice versa when it comes to BFM, I feel like. That's hopefully that answers your question.
What is it like then flying BFM in the aeroplane? I know from talking to light grey guys, they talk about the tickle on the wings, and there's the mouse, and then there's the elephant stamping on the wings that sort of give an indication as to where you are against the stall. Is that true for Strike Eagle? Are there little telltale signs that you feel in the airframe, or you feel through the stick? And just to complicate the question unnecessarily, can you talk a little bit about what those sort of decision-making matrices are that you might be using when you BFM? Are you talking about things like OODA loop, or are you talking about something different?
Yeah, we could talk about that. I'm happy to talk about that as long as you want. But so one thing to know about the Strike Eagle is that it never met a knot it couldn't lose, right? So it runs out of energy, like you read about, and you don't really have a long opportunity to do sustained BFM with someone other than a Strike Eagle. Usually if you fight, go out there, you fight against F-22s or whatever, the fight's probably going to be over faster than it would be if you were fighting a Strike Eagle, because you can't sustain energy, and you have to maximize the amount of time that you're in a weapons engagement zone, and exploit that. And if you don't exploit those opportunities quickly enough, you're dead. So for the Strike Eagle, really, truly fighting the Strike Eagle well is about being able to maximize the opportunity that you're in a weapons engagement zone by taking every opportunity that you have while you have it, and not waiting for something better, or delaying, or not being fast with HOTAS. So where you make your money at, really, in the Strike Eagle, in my opinion, in BFM, is being ultra fast when it comes to getting a lock, or using your helmet, or with the AIM-9X or whatever, just using things as fast as you possibly can, and knowing where your envelope is, and knowing when he's about to min-range your missile, or you're outranged from a gunshot, or you need to go back to call an MRM or an AMRAM, and then be able to take a shot, and knowing exactly where you're at in that in time and space is really where you make your money in the Strike Eagle, in my opinion, because you don't have a lot of opportunity to saddle up behind somebody like you would if you were in an F-22, So from the Strike Eagle perspective, it's actually kind of funny, because when I first started in the Strike, I was all about pulling as many G's as that jet would pull, and being as aggressive as I possibly can. And the older that I've gotten, I just figure out that with the Strike Eagle, it's a lot more about finesse when it comes to maneuvering the airplane. And the old adage of that you trade nose position for with energy wisely is 100% true in the Strike Eagle. If you're not going to cash it in, you just can't keep cashing it in all the time, because you just don't have much to cash in. So you have to be extremely deliberate, and saving as much energy as you possibly can, and then making your moves when you have the best possibility of success. and then making sure that you succeed there. It's sort of like fighting asymmetric warfare, if you would. If you're the underdog in BFM most of the time. So you got to find a way to be as asymmetric as you possibly can. So that's that, and usually that doesn't involve pulling a ton of G's, because you're gonna lose energy, and then you're gonna be shit out of luck overall. There is a big difference, though, even within the Strike Eagle, of the 220 motor jets. So the small motor jets and the 229s, as far as what you can and can't do. With the 220s, you just have to be. You have to be careful about how you're going to handle your energy situation, especially against, better opponents than you. And the Strike Eagle obviously does a lot of multi-role stuff. So when you actually, more of a realistic scenario, when you may find yourself in BFM, you could be carrying bombs, you could be carrying wing tanks, etc. So you have to figure out what your jettison plan is, and if you're going to give up the whole entire mission by punching off your bombs, or you're going to try to find a way not to engage in a turning fight with somebody else. How can I stiff arm somebody to be able to do that? All of that tactical decision making is a lot different than somebody who's, like an F-22 that's internally carrying his ordnance, and he's, primarily in an air-to-air role. Anyways, hopefully that answers a little bit of the question. But I can talk a little bit more if you want about the feel and the mouses and the elephants and stuff.
Yeah,
if you want.
Yeah. Talk about that, and then I'd like to go back to the helmet-mounted sight as well. But yes,
yeah.
That could be my follow-up question.
The jet definitely talks to you. You can feel it after a while. As a matter of fact, you can actually, if you're fighting another Strike Eagle, you can look across the circle and you can tell what energy state he's at based on where his nose is at and where his stab position is at. So his horizontal stabilizer, because it's a flying stab that moves, all the way. You can tell if he's really dug in and his nose isn't moving, that he's at a really low energy state based on his nose rate and where his flight controls are. And those are things that are pretty easy to pick out if you fly the jet a lot and you kind of know what it looks like and know exactly what to look for. The gun is canted a little bit up, so if someone is gunning you, it can still look to the layperson like he doesn't have his gun exactly, where you would think it would be within lead, but he still may be shooting at you in that case. And then same thing goes with weapons engagement zones as far as the 9X and AMRAAM and stuff, is that it opens up a very wide range of places where you can get shot from if you're defensive. So you're pretty much always in a WES, if he's behind you for the most part. But as far as the actual feel of the jet has, it goes light to moderate to what we call the deep end of the moderate buffet. And the deep end of the moderate buffet is usually once you're not performing the jet at all, and everything that you're doing is losing energy at a rate that is getting you nowhere, essentially. The jet's essentially falling out of the sky at that case, and may or may not be just relying on whatever thrust that you have in the back end to keep your nose, where it's at. The jet also will depart, so you can depart the jet from controlled flight, unlike some other jets out there that have a lot of nanny controls that keep you, from stalling in any sort of weird flight control spot. But this one, you can put the flight controls where you want it to, and that could work out for better or for worse. Sometimes you could do some really cool, really cool jinx. Other times you can depart the jet, but overall, it's actually a very, very easy airplane to fly, and I think even slower speed, it's a pretty easy airplane to fly, and it's super responsive. There's a couple of regimes where you don't really want to get into with it, and especially if you're fighting, it all depends on the bandit. If you're fighting an F-22, there's certain airspeed regimes where you don't want to be at. You're going to die. Like he's going to be able to turn so much faster than you, So you need to keep, whether it's keeping your knots up to a certain point or whatever. And but there's no angle of attack limits, in the stick, like some other airplanes have. So you can slam that sucker back and get as much as you want to out of it, for better or for worse. But yeah, the jet eventually talks to you within the buffet. Some jets are a little bit different depending on. It's kind of a long story, but it depends on how recent the ailerons were changed out and the bushings in the ailerons, and there's a couple other like little nuanced items. But some of the jets feel a little bit different as far as buffet and what Mach number that you're pulling versus what buffet that you're getting out, and how you're accelerating, and what where you're at vertically, I guess, within the circle, whether your nose is down or your nose is pointed back up, how much you're going to get out of it, and where you're close to your corner velocity, or if you're not, or your corner velocity with, X given assumptions behind it. The jet will no doubt talk to you, and you can get to a light buffet and know that you're max performing the airplane as much as it possibly can. And then once you're in the deep end of the moderate buffet, generally you're not performing the airplane at all, and you need to consciously ease on the stick. It's a pretty common mistake that if you see somebody who's just at the edge of your weapons engagement zone, you want to do everything you can to pull him into your weapons engagement zone, by pulling back on the stick. And in that case, in this jet, oftentimes what that does is it pushes you into this deep end of the moderate buffet, and then you get zero performance and zero nose rate out of the jet. And then you've actually done yourself a lot worse by trying to be greedy with that initial shot. So that's pretty much, yeah.
So does that, I'm sort of, straying a little bit out of my lane here. I mean, I do lots of flight sims and stuff like that, but you've got this rate versus radius argument, or you could be a rate fighter or a radius fighter. Does that suggest that you are more of a radius fighter then? So it's more about sort of keeping the turn circle, managing the size of the turn circle, rather than trying to get it round it really, really quickly.
For myself, I would actually take a completely different stance on all of that and say that if you're in the Strike Eagle and you're trying for a rate or versus radius fight initially, you're probably going to die soon. And the reason is because it's kind of hard to explain. But if all we had was a 9 mic on the jet, they're one of the old, lower performing IR missiles, and the gun, it would be much more of a more important to a game plan of whether you're going to go rate or radius, depending on what fighter that you're fighting against and whether he's better at rate or radius versus you, and depending on what his EM diagram looks like. Realistically now, when it comes to your 9X and AIM-120, you're looking to try to exploit the WES for as long as possible. And sometimes what that doesn't mean is getting on his turn circle, because the fact of the matter is that every turn circle out there is probably a better performing turn circle than the Strike Eagle is, and your chances of entering his turn circle and staying on a turn circle from an opponent, whether it's a J-10 or it's an F-22 or it's a Hornet or whatever, is pretty low, to be quite honest with you. So what you really are trying to do is you really want to try to exploit the maximum amount of time that you can remain in that WES, and doing that sometimes means that you need to put your jet into a different spot rather than think about a rate versus radius argument, because in order to get into that WES, you might need to steal vertical energy, or you might need to say that, hey, well, right now I'm going to do a rate argument because I can maximize my time in a WES versus a rate. But depending on the shape of his turn circle, maybe a radius argument is going to be is going to be different, or the way to go, or I need to shape how I'm thinking about this opponent much differently to be able to maximize the opportunity into a WES overall. So kind of the goal of, I would say, like BFM exercises and going out there to, bet some beers or, bragging rights at the bar is always getting into a guns WES. But with the Strike Eagle vis-a-vis a Su-30 or Su-35, like if you're trying to get into a guns WES, which would be great, you're giving up so much to be able to do that your return on investment is probably pretty low. And we have this thing called the control zone. And the control zone is extremely fluid, very dynamic, can't quite be defined in numbers by a book because it's entirely based on what opponent that you're facing and then what weapon that you're using and how you're able to control the opponent or pressure the opponent depending on which side of the zone that you're at. And that changes completely, overall. So the old traditionalist argument would be that you go out there and do exercises and it mirrors a lot more of your 9 mic or your older IR, pictures to where now you really need to focus on a turn circle entry. You need to focus on, some other stuff. And, but that it's a little skewed when it comes to the Strike Eagle because based on the turn performance, where you're going to be at and what opportunities that you have and how long you can exploit those opportunities.
Obviously, the Fulcrum flanker threat for a long time. I know this because visiting squadrons 15 years ago, hearing them talk about it in briefs. You've got the high off bore sight capability that the the threat systems had. You've now got that. You've mentioned the helmet and AIM-9X a few times. If everything were equal, then presumably going into that sort of pursuing the philosophy you've addressed in terms of the WES, keeping them in the WES for as long as possible is the most important thing, then presumably there would be parity. But actually, I guess you're bargaining then that your combination of high off bore sight missile and helmet are better than his.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, and I think that most of our going out the door assumptions are that our tech is better than their tech right now, or it should be. Whether that's the actual case or not, I think it's who knows. And I think it's worth exploring the envelope of saying that. Well, what if he does have a crazy off-bore sight capability that's way better than we think it is? Where's that going to put me in BFM? And it's really getting to the point now where essentially anywhere you're at, if you both start out equal, I mean, you're both, held hostage by each other, if you would. So that turning fight is a lot different. So how am I going to, where are the edges of his, weapons employment zone? What if he could, look back behind his tails, as you're, and just shoot anything that he sees, with an ultra maneuverable missile. I think it's getting to the point now where technology is evolving, to maybe be able to do that, or the other thing is that, well, what if his flare combination or his countermeasures or whatever it is, what if they're really, really good, and he's, like our AIM-9X or whatever is just not going to work. What are you going to do at that point? And a lot of the argument would say, well, that's why we go to a guns WES, because the gun is the only you're not really going to defeat the gun with countermeasures. You're going to have to defeat it with maneuvers. So I don't know, and that's a pretty compelling reason to try to get to a guns WES, or just try to avoid the fight altogether and say, hey, is it worth it to burn a shit ton of gas in a turning engagement to try to get my underperforming fighter into a guns WES with the Su-30, given our fuel states or giving our, weapon states or giving, whatever support assets are around, or, if you're doing...
Do you really have a choice, Stinger? I mean, I sort of assume that if you get to emerge with one of those guys, even if you accelerate away, he's probably going to be able to turn around and shoot you. If it might not be an IR missile, but it might be one of his radar missiles. Are you not committed once you get to if you come up against a Su-35? Are you not just committed to fighting it? Is there a viable way of getting away from that thing?
We talk about this at the bar probably every Friday, because that's a perfectly valid and logical argument. The other portion of that argument would be like, okay, how'd you get there, and did you shoot everything on your way to the merge? Did you because I'd rather shoot a flanker that's in front of me, on my radar, than I would who's trying to look behind me, betting that this AIM-9X, who, oh, by the way, has is 0/1 in combat, whether this thing is actually going to work or not, and he doesn't have the right flare combination, and I'm just going to burn a shit ton of gas turning around in circles with him, waiting for hopefully my wingman, who, assuming that he didn't get shot down, or assuming that I have somebody who's close by who has the gas and the weapons to be able to make a difference, assuming that he's going to be able to take a shot on this 2v1 sort of scenario. So I would say that my decision calculus would be, how do I terminate this threat at range if I can within the confines of the ROE, and then how do I avoid this threat, or how do I convert on him without him being aware that I'm there, or how do I hide? For Strike Eagles, we do a lot of low levels, and so the obvious answer there would be, try to get in the mud as much as possible, and maybe give his radar some trouble looking into the ground, or try to get lost in an undercast layer, or multiple other venues of I don't want to call it really camouflage, but just give him as much difficulty as he possibly can to be able to see where I'm at, and then start to lose his SA. And then if I can maintain SA on him, maybe I'll try to get into the most advantageous spot that we possibly can. Which is actually where when we talk about Perch BFM, is where, from my understanding, Perch BFM evolved from, was trying to get into a position of advantage as fast as possible without using as much gas, and then being able to exploit that opportunity once it was available. Because eventually the jig will be up. Eventually he'll see you and he'll break into you and all that sort of stuff. But I would try to get as much advantage as possible, rather than doing a high aspect merge, where he, passes within. Because there's no training rules when it comes to, the enemy and stuff. And he's going to get as close to you as he possibly can without hitting you, and then you're doing the same thing. So you guys could even trade paint or anything, any sort of other stuff. But yeah, so in that case, I would say that, okay, what is the context in which I'm going to the merge? What is the context in which I can get an advantageous, within visual range engagement with this guy? And then I would explore all of those options. And I think that even spreading your wingman out to a crazy geometry, if you're 2v1, which is what we normally do in ACM, is to be able to at least get somebody to get in there with an advantage. If I have to turn around and run while my wingman goes in, if he's focused on me as the bright shiny object, and my wingman can get in there, then we'll try something like that, which is kind of what ACM is structured for. When you do 2v1 and you move from a beyond visual range environment to a within visual range environment.
On that note, do you I suppose when you use something like AMRAAM, there's always the danger that it could transfer lock onto something other than what you want it to shoot down, especially when it goes active, it does its own thing. That's a possibility, I suppose. Do you, with IR missiles, work with similar assumptions then that, if you, as in, the engaged fighter, are sort of shooting at the bad guy and he's right behind the good guy, when you train, do you consider the possibility that the missile might be locked onto the person you're trying to protect rather than the person you're trying to down?
Oh, absolutely. And, that never happens in training ever. So yeah, it's a huge part of shot deconfliction is normally what we call it. And you have to do it because the further you're taking the shot, right, the longer the missile is traveling. So technically, the more shot deconfliction space that you need. So if somebody is in a whirling dervish, and super tight, and you're trying to take a shot from pretty far away, who knows what's going to happen? And in some cases, if the guy, if your wingman is extremely defensive and it's only a matter of seconds before he dies, then sometimes you're willing to take that risk to say that, hey, he's going to die one way or the other. I got to try to shoot in there and see what happens. But hopefully, if the fight has progressed to that point, then hopefully you start to close the range as much as you can to be able to make sure that you can back up your wingman to the maximum extent that you can overall. And then he'll try to preserve the range to be able to make that happen without compromising, or being within a WES for very long, because it sort of all presupposes that we're strictly using a within visual range like ID or ROE criteria and a within visual range missiles. But if a flanker is shooting at range, then all those things kind of go out the window. But yeah, to answer your question, yeah, shot deconfliction is definitely a huge thing. It's just like you're doing CAS and you're danger close, So there's a time and a place where you'd want to up your risk to be able to preserve your wingman's life. So hopefully the guys at Raytheon can have some magic up their sleeve when it comes to that. Who knows? So.
Just tying then what you talked about right at the beginning in regards to decision making, pilot and command stuff, with the feel of the aeroplane, the fact you've got game plans, there's geometry, there's assessing what he's doing, what you're doing, what your wingman's doing. Is there a point at which, or rather, at what point does some of this stuff happen at an unconscious level? There's this expression, isn't there, cognitive saturation or a helmet fire, where it all gets too much. There's too much to process, too much to do. Situation awareness goes out of the window. Do you, over time, start to find that you're processing some of these decisions, you're making these assessments, you're formulating your next move without really being conscious that you're doing it?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think one of the struggles that people have, or I don't even know if I would call it a struggle, maybe a evolution of learning, is that they usually your best fighter pilots and your best tacticians are people that can prioritize all the important things that they need to focus on, and everything else goes into this subconscious, it doesn't really matter, I'm not really going to give it a lot of thought or priority as far as what's happening. Tactically speaking, I think you do develop sort of a tacit knowledge for understanding how things are going to go and what the enemy is going to do. All that being said, trying to think about the best way to describe this, but we can do a lot better job of that, I think, in the fighter community, because the way that scenarios go right now, and you can even look at red flag, you can look at your standard one each ops training sortie, is that they are very, red air is generally very scripted and follows they follow a very prescribed structure of how they're going to operate, and what our assumptions are with those. So very, very rarely do you have any type of cognitive dissonance that doesn't happen, or that something you don't expect happens with red air. And what that does is it builds this decision propensity to assume. Well, yeah, it just builds a lot of assumptions that you have subconsciously about what you think red air is going to do and what you think the enemy is going to do, and how you're going to prosecute an attack. If you go to real life, that may not always be the case, and I feel like we've learned these lessons over and over and over again in combat, of that you really don't know what the enemy is going to do, and you really don't know that maybe he's been studying you forever and he knows exactly what you're going to do, and he's already come up with something completely different, and he just hasn't told you about it yet, Or so your ability to deal with the changing environment, I think, is at a loss, at least in the fighter community. It's not totally lost, but it is not as good as it can be. So, and that goes back to this whole structured environment of expecting some sort of structure, which we talked about in the whole UPT conversation and back up through the B course, et cetera, is that you're expecting a very, very, very structured, okay, this is how they're going to act. This is how I'm going to act. This is what the scenario is. This is how we're reading the script, et cetera. And, normally fighter pilots would pride themselves on not following a script or not following any of this sort of stuff. But that's exactly what's happening, is that it's very scripted, and it's rationalized through something that we call desired learning objectives, which say that, hey, well, we really want him to learn, or her to learn how to run the radar appropriately in this scenario, or we really want them to understand how to do an intercept without porking it away, or we really want them to be able to understand that geometry is very important here, or it may not be as important here, but it is important here for this. And those are all valid things, but once that sort of takes over, then people start to build that tacit level of assumptions when it comes to, I don't even have to think about how I need to prosecute this scenario. I know what's going to happen, so I know I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it. So then you can get very good at all these training scenarios, and then when you get to combat, you die, which is pretty much exactly what we saw in, especially in Vietnam, when it came to using Korean War tactics with F4s against MiG-17s and MiG-21s, and it didn't really pan out that well. At the beginning, they had to completely change their tactics overall, and that came from that same sort of process that we were just talking about. So to go way back here to your question, that do you have this sort of subconscious level of movements that you're going to do? The answer is yes. Some of those are bad, some of those are good, but you always have to come back to a debrief and then evaluate. Okay. Could we have been seriously exploited in this situation? Was this really the best decision to do? If we thought about, if we talked to Red Air, hey, did you have the opportunity to do this, or did you have the opportunity to, maybe kill our two ship here or there? And then you go back to what assumptions that you had as far as your two ship or four ship goes. And say, hey, we didn't bring that into our planning. We didn't talk about it during our brief. We didn't talk about a what-if scenario based on, maybe a most dangerous course of action from Red Air, maybe most likely course of action from Red Air. Maybe we need to reevaluate those, how we think about them. And then you would go back, you would take that hopefully to the next brief, bring that back in and learn that, overall. So yeah, there are some cases are good, some cases are bad.
One thing that certainly back in the 70s and the 80s, the aggressors and the Red Eagles were doing is that they were doing those canned scenarios. But then when somebody had progressed through the sort of layered training and they'd achieved those desired learning outcomes that you mentioned, the cuffs then came off, and it was then just an American flying a MiG or an F5 against an American flying an F-15 or an F-16, whatever it was, and there were, the red air piece kind of went out the window, and it was just a case of I'm going to thrash you, or if not, I'm going to thrash you. I'm going to give you some more desired learning outcomes that maybe you weren't aware of or weren't thinking about. Is that not the case then nowadays? If you go up against some red air guys, can you not just give them the brief that actually cuffs come off? Surprise me.
Yeah, we can do that, and we're supposed to do it within what we call CT or continuation training, where it's not somebody's not somebody's upgrade or whatnot. Pardon me for just a second. Yeah, we definitely can do those, but some of the pretense in which it's all kind of context based, and we can probably talk a little bit more offline about this. But there's certain presuppositions in the way that we fight and the way that scenarios are going to happen. And I'm trying to think of a better way to describe this. I guess red flag is a pretty good example of it. Red flag, you have kind of like the red forces versus the blue forces, and the red forces are here, the blue forces are there. Here's the objectives, here's the targets. Okay. Let's all converge, and then we'll fight this big war and reenact Desert Storm and all this stuff. If you were to truly say the cuffs are off, then it would really just be, okay, this is the objective. That's it. Like you guys can literally, just defend it however you want to, which would open up Pandora's box to all sorts of assumptions that you never thought of, whether it was what if they did a preemptive, attack on our base, or what if they came up with, I don't know, put up a fleet of 1,000,000 balloons with all C4, like that. There's this whole like Pandora's box of of possibilities and outcomes that can happen. And then the other thing is that, what if you had one of those scenarios, but all of your intel assessments were completely wrong? And your what you thought their capabilities were they were just different. Like what we thought their missile ranges were, they were they're 30% better, and now you're on day one or day two, and you're taking 70%, 80% losses. Okay, what do you do then? And what do you do on day two when you have only 20% of the fleet that you started with? How are you going to solve that problem? Those are the kind of scenarios that I think, and how to do that actively while it's happening, all that sort of stuff is where when we say the cuffs come off, now we start putting people into a uncomfortable decision matrix where there's more unknowns. There's not the decisions are not very clear. It's not just maybe the ROE is not clear at all, and it's not just like, okay, those guys over there past the line are all enemy. What if it's actually 70% of them are civilians, but they all fly the same exact airplane, or 50% of them are from country X and 50% are from country Y. Don't shoot the guys from country X, even though they fly the same exact planes. And the only way to tell the difference is a roundel on the, side of the airplane. So, that's truly when the enemy starts to complicate our decision making, and they say, "Hey, the cuffs truly come off." Then it's not just I'm going to be as good as I can at what I've been training for, in the manner in which I've been training for, for the past 20 years or so. That's what I would kind of imagine. From a more of a tactical sense, though, that you're talking about the Red Eagles and the cups coming off and just being mano out there and stuff. That can certainly happen, and it does, and it's a lot of fun. We come back and we debrief it, but it doesn't happen enough. I would say it doesn't happen to the point where we'd like it to.
Bringing the conversation back then, Stinger, to the Strike Eagle. Obviously, the objective of this conversation is not to try and get any secrets out of you or anything like that. But I'd be curious to know what you can say about the AESA radar in the aeroplane, and not parametrics, not numbers, but it's is it a game changer? Does it do a much better job in the air-to-air environment or the air-to-ground environment? What in your view is its value?
So as of right now, the AESA radar and the Strike Eagle is great. I mean, it's a great radar, and I say this as a skeptic of current technology. I think the APG-82 is a great radar. Game changer. I don't know if I use the term game changer because you'd imply that you're actually somehow changing the way the enemy thinks about everything else, which I don't know if I buy that or not, but it is a very, very good radar. But it still is, not the end all be all of targeting systems. And it's still, every technology that comes out, every, whether it's stealth or whether it's, great AESA radars, whether it's whatever, everything will eventually have its vulnerabilities understood, and then it'll eventually be exploited. So it's really a matter of time when you have this evolution overall of where threats will counter things and stuff. And I think that the time with the AESA radar, the APG-82, is probably limited if it doesn't keep evolving fast. If we don't keep evolving the technology that's in there right now, which I would try to push it. It's not a 40 or 50 year radar. It is great and it is awesome and it does some really great, cool stuff. But eventually, at the rate that technology is increasing, at the way that we're something like memory, if you think about processing power in memory, what the exponential curve is on that, from just 20 years ago, I think we're gonna see a little bit more of that when it comes to radars, and then what electronic attack looks like, and then what how it can be exploited or jammed or whatever. And I think that over the period of the next 15, 20 years, that we'll see the APG-82 will probably look like one of the mech scan radars do right now. So yeah, to answer your question, it's great and it's awesome, and I think the Strike Eagle right now has the best radar in the fighter fleet.
I saw a marketing video that showed it being used in air-to-ground and air-to-air, not at the same time because that would be impossible, but in such short amounts of time. It's sort of a time-sharing mechanism, so you could be running a mapping routine or something and sort of keeping an eye out for bad guys in front of you at the same time. Is that true? Can it do that?
Yeah, it's a pretty solid, capable system.
What is the contract then between you and the WSO with regards to who's doing what with any of the aircraft systems at any time? I mean, if you're if you take an intercept as an example, is it still the case that the WSO runs the intercept until a certain mileage from the target, and then you take over, or how does that work?
So normally the pilot runs most of the. Well, it does depend on what contracts you set up, but most of the time I would say that the pilot runs the air-to-air piece of the intercept and with the radar, and then The WSO will primarily take over air to ground targeting or things, whether he's using, the sniper pod air to ground, or if he's using the radar to map something air to ground, or whatnot. But primarily, most of the contracts worked where the WSO will keep overall SA of the situation, and the WSO typically wears what they call kind of like the defensive hat, if you will, of the jet, to make sure that there's not a threat that you're not that maybe you don't see or you're not focusing on, and then he or she will keep you safe from stooging into a missile WES of any threat out there. The same thing goes for surface-to-air missiles, and then the WSO will, but is primarily, as far as targeting goes, focused on air-to-ground stuff, and then the pilot is generally focused a little bit more on air-to-air stuff. And that can swap, and that can be different depending on exactly what it is that you're doing, or how many threats you're focusing on, or maybe he's monitoring the guys to the east, you're monitoring the guys to the west. There's a whole menu of options that you can in contracts that you can kind of come to from both sides, I guess. So
if you think about the Strike Eagle in its sort of original incarnation with the APG-70 and 1990, 1991 time frame, going out to patch mapping using the synthetic aperture radar to build a picture of a target and then dropping CBU on it or unguided bombs, are you still doing similar sorts of things in an air to ground capacity? You talked earlier about using low level as a way of extending out of a fight and causing some problems for your opponent in terms of making him look down into the ground clutter. Is that still that traditional patch map, low level ingress, pop up, drop an unguided bomb? Is that still something you practice or do?
So to answer your question, yes, there is a kind of a niche part of our training that we do where we practice and maintain some skill sets when it comes to unguided deliveries. Obviously, that's not really the preferred way to do that. Generally speaking, if you have a target and your ability to drop a bomb exactly on that target starts to expand. So an unguided bomb, you may hit 5, 10, 20 meters away from the target, depending on a bunch of different factors, because you're dropping the bomb. No matter what the jet is saying from an auto-computed delivery, there's all kinds of other variables and factors at work. Speed in which you're dropping the bomb, exactly where your hand is on the stick. If you're dropping a bomb at 400 or 500 knots, then, even the slightest pressure on the stick could have an effect on a bomb that falls for a while, to where it could be, 10, 20 meters, 30 meters away, whatever it is. So if you're trying to destroy a target, sometimes that if you sort of take the average of that, you might need, more weapons to service that target than you otherwise would if you had a JDAM that that, hey, I can hit this thing right through the pickle barrel, as it were. Or a laser guided bomb, hey, I can put the laser on there and I can make this bomb fly exactly to the laser. Then maybe you don't need it to carry as many weapons with you and ingress through. So that's kind of another consideration from a logistics side of that. How many bombs does this target actually need? And then with guided bombs, you can shape the parameters of how the bomb is going to hit the target. So if you need to have a high impact angle, say an 85-degree impact angle, because you have a penetrating case on the bomb, and you need the bomb to, go through a few floors or, wherever, then usually unguided bombs are not going to be able to have that effect, because you're not going to be able to shape the parameters in which they actually hit with any degree of, what I call bettable accuracy, that you would be able to bet a paycheck or bet your wingman that bomb would hit and destroy the building. So that, to to answer your question, we do train to kind of that old school way of approaching, a target and getting in there. But at the end of the day, I mean, you got to figure if you send in a 4-ship, you're sending a 4-ship into a highly contested area with, 4 $56 million airplanes and 8 crew members, and you're trying to drop dumb gravity bombs on a target that's, if it's highly defended, then your ROI is probably, your return on investment probably isn't the best, or your risk level, or your, what you want to do with those airplanes, essentially you would probably look to more of a JASM, or a standoff weapon option, or something to that effect, or a guided weapon of some kind, or something that you could get a little bit more insurance that your 8 aircrew aren't going to be POWs based on the fact that you want to drop a bomb that, was similar to the ones used in Vietnam to take out a target that is, you're unsure if it can actually even get the effects on the target. So
I suppose I was thinking it's maybe a false equivalent, maybe it's inappropriate, but I was thinking you referenced earlier about taking Korean War tactics and taking them to Vietnam and finding they didn't work. And similarly, there was a philosophy, it wasn't a philosophy actually, it was a doctrinal change around the use of missiles for long-range air-to-air combat and the death of the dogfight. And of course, that also transpired to be incorrect. And I suppose I was just thinking, there is this assumption, and it goes back to what you were talking about a minute ago, which is what are the range of possibilities in terms of simulating what the bad guy can do or what they will do. But there's an assumption that if you're going to go in and you have a sort of a very netcentric sensor fusion, electronic attack, networked type game plan, that the bad guys can take that away from you. They can jam those networks. They can interfere with those networks. That if you're using bombs that require you to transmit back to the guided weapon as it enters the terminal phase of guidance, which target to go after, GBU 15, AGM 130, that kind of thing, those links could be jammed. And I wondered whether, maybe it's a very, very outside chance you actually may end up, if you went up against someone like China, let's say, you may end up having all of your toys taken away from you, all of the tech mitigated, and you need to revert to some of the traditional methods of getting the job done. Do you think that's too outlandish a scenario?
No, I mean, I don't think it's super outlandish. I think, I mean, anything is possible. And I don't know if you've read Ghost Fleet or not, because it sounds like that's kind of the scenario that you're alluding to. But I also think that there should be a level of technical evolution and innovation that happens on a decentralized in a decentralized way to be able to solve problems faster than you would have to gamble all of your forces on doing suicidal missions. And if you think back to even World War II, something like Bomber Escort with the Mustangs, and understanding when external wing drop tanks were created, they were created to solve a problem. And I think that you could argue that, hey, the Germans took away some of our ability to produce these parts, or they took away some ability for us to get into, or they moved their factories way further south, so it was outside of the range of most fighter escorts. I guess we're just going to have to figure it out with what we have at the time. So some of that is certainly true, but then some of it's like, okay, well, how do we come up with maybe an innovative way to solve these problems that we're having with what materials and what technologies are available to us? And then that's when you gather all of your people together and say, hey, listen, can we do, what would it take to do a drop tank, or several drop tanks on a Mustang, or can we take out, can we put, can we add to this fuselage tank? Can we, do whatever it is? Can we solve these problems? And can we solve them on the front line rather than solving them back at, the factory or back at, industry headquarters? So what I would like to think is that the DoD is taking a look at how do I form this type of decision making, this type of problem solving, where I don't have to just accept that, boys, we're gonna load up some Mark 82s and Mark 84s, and 80% of you are gonna get shot down because we need to be inside of X miles to release this, and that's just how it is. I think that if we look at the tactical evolution of history, I think that some people have done that, but I think that others may have come up with a little bit more innovative ways to solve problems, and maybe the initial systems that they put to work didn't work. Like you're saying, you can jam the links of a lot. I mean, that jamming is pretty easy. GPS jamming is pretty pretty cost effective. So how do you square that cat? Well, hey, can I use, an INS doesn't need GPS. Well, what kind of accuracy can we get out of this INS? Well, can we move this INS to this weapon system, or can we do this? How would that? What kind of, programming would that take? Or, it's amazing what you can do with like a Raspberry Pi, for as far as like computing power goes. Hey, do we need it to do these computations to be able to get it, or I don't know. I guess my point is that hopefully we are creating a system in which we can create answers to problems that we don't know exist yet when it comes to that sort of those tactical problem sets. It would kind of, I guess I would kind of take it back to, I think during the First and Second World War, right, we kept horses around for a long time because people they didn't believe much in combustion engines and transportation as far as reliability goes. But then we eventually figured out that we can, most of the Army is equipped with, combustion engines and turbine vehicles and all that sort of stuff. So then we can slowly start to get rid of our horses, and then now the horse cavalry used to be the bastion of all that was combat, because it was reliable, because horses were reliable and all this. And now we're saying, well, we can use a little bit more technology substituted in there, find some problems, solve things, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I don't know. I'm not, it could be all.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think there's a memory, a story that sticks in my mind. Somebody, a striking guy, telling me that he had flown against a training aircraft that had a DIRFM jammer, a digital radio frequency modulation jammer, which apparently you can build for 10 a penny, and you can stick them in something small, like a light aircraft. And he said that the DIRFM jammer shut down his radar. So I'm guessing he was using, I don't know if it was the APG-82 or 63, probably 63. But it just shocked him. And the idea you talked about, in a scenario against a bad guy, if they've got a bunch of aircraft, but these are all civilians, you can't shoot them down. What if they put a load of DIRFM jammers in civilian aircraft and then they go around jamming everyone's radars? And if they're that effective, it's not just that they spoil your picture or make it difficult for you to find the bad guy or whatever, find fixed target track, engage, that actually just shuts your radar down, then that would be a big concern. So I guess it's just the art of the possible, isn't it? It's as you describe, it's how far do you want to take the scenario, and what's realistic and what's not. But I wanted to ask just a final question for me, if it's okay, and then I've got a couple of AMA questions from the Discord channel that I run for 10% True. Sure. One of the things that we don't really ever talk about, or I don't talk about, but I'm curious about, is the mission planning software that you use. I did see, as a result of some of the exposure I've had, being invited to go and fly with squadrons and visit them. I've seen, I think it's called Falcon View. I don't know if that's still what you use, but a piece of software that lets you do your weaponeering and understand if you want to, kill a target, what's the best way to do it in terms of, weapons effects and so on. Has that evolved much? Do you have a way of sort of mission fly through where you can pre-visualize what it is that you're going to be doing as either a pilot or a 2-ship or a 4-ship? Is the mission planning process more involved now than it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago?
I think yes and no. Some parts of it are more automated, but some of the automated options give you really just give you too many options to go down about how you're going to attack a target. And sometimes you can spend too much time in mission planning trying to find the 100% solution when really what you need is sort of the 80% or 85% solution based on all of the unknowns that you'll probably come across in combat. But the software that we use now is called Jumps, and you can pretty much do everything from normal flight planning on it to there's really a lot of stuff that you can do, and there's great capabilities that you can get into on how you want to egress, around surface air missiles, or how you want to plan an attack, or what formation you need to be in to ensure that bombs hit, at exactly a specific time or a specific distance apart, or where the sniper pod is going to be able to laze things without masking on the jet. There's a whole list of things that you can do as far as mission planning goes that models stuff for you and does some really great points that you can. And it's kind of come a long ways, but the more options that you seem to get on it, the more bugs that get into the program, and then the slower the program seems to run. So you can have a couple instances where, you'll work up this big scenario and you'll be just ready to print, and then the computer will crash, and then you just put all this work into it, and then you can't pull it out, so to speak. There's that. So some guys, would rather just write on a map, and show you kind of old school there, and I really can't blame them. Or run some rules of thumb like numbers about how to do an attack or anything like that. But yeah, there's a combine that with some tools that we have on different classification ends and different imagery sources and different ways to model bomb penetration effects, or what kind of fuse that you need for what specific building, all that stuff. If you combine all those things together, I mean, there's some really great, cool stuff out there, and you can pretty much solve most scenarios that way.
Can you do a mission run through them? Could you because I visited the tornado guys up at Lossiemouth probably 10 or so years ago, and they were using a planning tool that let you do a run through. So you hit play effectively, and it would show you from the front seat what everything was going to look like, and you could you could make the bubbles of surface to air missiles appear, so you could see where you were relative to their missile engagement zone. Do you have that capability, or more importantly, really, I guess what I'm asking is, do you use it? If you have it, is it valuable to you to pre-visualize what you're going to fly?
We there's some points of that that we use, and some guys will use some products that let you, if you're going to do like a low-level attack, like when are you going to actually see the target? When are you going to, what does it look like, as you're maneuvering and you're trying to find the target? What are the lead-in features from your perspective at, 500, 300 feet or whatever? So we do use that, but normally what we do is we just take and we brief the run through of everything, kind of I won't say the old-fashioned way, but we try to talk about as many contingencies as we can while we're doing the run through, rather than watching a video feed or a video playback of exactly what's happening, or what the computer imagines were to happen. When we come back from the debrief, sometimes you can take all the ACMI data, you can put it back to, I think down at Checker Flag, they have a really cool system where you can actually see people shooting at each other at the same times. And you see this whole air war happen, which is really cool. And they're able to pair shots, and, it's actually quite phenomenal. But we use some of the debriefing tools like that. But as far as the just sitting there and watching, a video exact playbook, we don't typically use that, or really, yeah.
Okay. Let me pull up some questions, and there aren't that many, you'll be pleased to know. Have you got time for this?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, excellent. All right, so Scotty is a massive Strike Eagle fan, so he's provided 3 questions. So have a look here. Do you ever train for, or is there such a thing as single pilot mission in the Strike Eagle without any WSO? Is having a WSO a requirement for a flight?
Generally speaking, yes. There is a once in a while training happenstance where you might have a single pilot, airplane where they strap down the back seat, and that almost never happens. And usually that has to do with WSO availability, or maybe you have to move a jet somewhere, and they can't get all the WSOs are flying other jets or something, and there isn't that many. Then you might have that, but that happens. It's extremely rare for that to happen overall. And normally you train to fly as a pilot WSO combination, and then that's generally how you execute overall.
Okay, he's technically very familiar with the airplane, so he's asking, has anybody ever spoken about improving the CFT throughout your time in the airplane? With the EX keeping more or less the same CFT, that makes me think that there must be a way to improve the CFTs if we're going to keep flying them well into the future. And with all the bruise on the cheeks not usable for air-to-air and not even removable from the look of it, is there a performance on the table that could probably pick up? So I guess he's asking, are they going to improve? Are they going to make one where you can take those bruise off to make it slicker, improve some of those performance or excess power issues you were talking about?
So it's funny that, and that's a really great question, actually, because it's something we've talked about in the bar numerous times, because anybody with the E model, when you look at it, you see the Brew 46s on the top there, and they rarely ever get used. The Brew 47s, will get used, but the Brew 46s generally don't. And they're super draggy, and they just eat away gas that can be used for a number of different things. But we've talked about, hey, is there ability to put like some sort of sleek covers on them, to be able to reduce their drag signature by a little bit, or is there ability to actually, take them off? And usually the answer we get back is no. You just got to leave them on, suffer through it. As far as the EX goes, I wouldn't. The EX, for all the little niche improvements that it had, none of them were very profound improvements in the airframe, and all of them were nickel and dimed to a hey, yeah, we could do this, but we're going to charge you a lot of money to do it. So do you still want to do it or not? So whether or not that the transformation between all of them being Brew 47s or at least 1760 capable, it is a whole different story. But yeah, the shoulder stations on there, the Brew 46s would be nice if we could cover them up. There's been no talk of covering them up. I think don't hold me to it, but I think I remember while I was at Lake and Heath, there was some study that someone did where in an air-to-air roll, with the 229 motors, they took off the CFTs, and at certain regimes of flight, you were actually at a better fuel-saving perspective of without the CFTs on there and the reduced fuel load than you were with the CFTs and a higher drag index. So, and I think that was just with 229 jets. I'm not 100% sure of that. there's much of a difference with 220s, or it may have been vice versa. I don't quite remember, but there was something to be said about just removing the CFTs if you're going to air, and basically turning it into a more powerful C model with the 229 motors. Because the 229 motors, you pull them back at high altitude and kind of sip gas, as it were. But yeah, I would prefer to get rid of the Brew 46s, and I don't even really think we use them all that much in the in the Strike Eagle. The 229s are really kind of a tricky beast because if you go anywhere hot, you're either your takeoff and landing data suffers, especially your max support, and whether or not you get to a point where if you lose an engine, you can neither abort nor take off based on the load that you're at. So you're kind of in no man's land when it comes to that, and then you have to take a cable at the end of the runway. And that's kind of a trend line with hot days and loaded up 220s. So the more bombs that you put on the jet, sometimes you get to a point of diminishing returns when it comes to drag as well. And the 500-pounders, the 2,000-pound bombs are just ridiculous as far as the amount of gas and the amount of fuel that they take up. And if we could get into something like nano energetics, where you can get a lot bigger bang for the buck and a lot bigger bang for the drag index, then that would be the way to go. And I would like to see something that was different than the Brew setup. But the Brew 46s and 47s are enormously simple. They're easy, and they fit with the amount of quantity of weapons that we have. And obviously, all you really need is the lugs on the bombs to be able to fit them in there. So it's actually a really great question, though. I would love to be able to put covers on this thing. We think about every time I walk up to the jet, most of us think the exact same thing, of that these things are just useless drag, creators sticking out there.
His final question then was, what are your thoughts on the Agile Combat Employment ACE for using the Strike Eagle as a bomb truck? He says, from the sound of this program, these ferry Eagles are going to be on station as well as ferrying the bombs at the same time. Are they even capable of dropping all those bombs if needed? And he says, being hands-off, JDAM, drag might be the main concern here, but what's your thought on this being both combat effective directly by dropping bombs or indirectly by helping on standing up remote deployments?
So yeah, I guess getting back to the Brew 46 argument, so recently they came up with the ability to basically load up the Strike Eagle with JDAMs for all stations, all the CFT stations, not just the 1760 stations. So to my knowledge, and I'm not really deep on the program on that, but to my knowledge, they cannot drop any of the shoulder stations, any of the JDAMs when it comes to that. So there's kind of a strict ferry only, when it comes to that, and there's no real communication with the jet that happens on the Brew 46 station. So to answer his question with how do I think about the ACE, I think it's the ACE overall concept is I think it's important, and I'm initially skeptical of it at first, and but I think it's super important. The whole idea with carrying the bombs and all that sort of stuff is that you're expanding your logistics network to say that now we don't need just a C-17 full of weapons, or we don't need to allocate all these mobility assets to be able to provide for a strike fighter group, somewhere. We can carry bombs to the fight ourselves, or we can go back and forth, or basically we can do more with what we have. And I think if you look at a theater like Europe, it makes a lot of sense when it comes to dispersing your forces out. Should you have some sort of, apocalypse, happen when it comes to targeting stuff. And then fighter bases are especially vulnerable. So now you spread out, you complicate the enemy's targeting problem. And then you expand on your logistics, because if you had 30 or 40 of these different fighter operating locations, you probably would have trouble coordinating, especially if your comms were down, et cetera, et cetera. You would have trouble coordinating for logistics backfill on weapons and supplies, all that sort of stuff. So the more that you can do organically, generally speaking, the better. Which is one of the options, and said, hey, can we do this? We should be able to, if we can hang these bombs based on the lugs, well, we should be able to ferry them. Okay, great. But we just can't drop them, from those stations. So no big deal there. As far as it's a Strike Eagle, a big bomb truck. I think I think that's probably pretty accurate. I think it depends on. I think we're gonna have to do a lot of soul searching on what the bang for the buck for a JDAM actually is, as far as risk exposure and what targets that you're going after, and whether or not those bombs are going to satisfy or service a target, and then what other options that you have to be able to do that, and what options that you have. The Strike Eagle right now doesn't carry APG-WS, which is a forward-firing rocket based on the Zuni platform. But if the Strike Eagle maybe had APKWS or some other cheaper alternative to what they're doing right now, you might be able to trade those munitions with Apache units or F-16s or et cetera. And then now we come up with a little bit better solution on how to solve logistics problems for deployed units overall. So opening up the ACE can of worms, I think it's really good. And it also challenges a lot of pilots and flight leads to start thinking about how do I operate outside of that structure, that very structured environment that we were just talking about, what kind of defines everyday life for most fighter squadrons. How do I land at a field that may not have all the ground support that I need, or ground support that I'm used to? How do I coordinate for fuel? How do I do all this sort of stuff? Just like we were talking about all these skill sets that we use, in civilian flying all the time. Now, fighter guys have to start thinking about them, which is all this big turn of irony here. But in any case, hopefully that answers the question.
So Jalorian21 asks, how does selection work for CSO slots? How is someone selected for a nav or WSO versus EWO slot? And is it assigned before UCT, or do you compete for it while you're in UCT?
That's a great question. And to be quite honest with you, I don't really know. The program has evolved quite a bit since I was there. And the way that it happened while I was there, everybody enters as a CSO, or the CSO, Combat Systems Officer, and then you all do the exact same program, and then like 3 weeks prior to the program ending is when you get your drop night, and then you get assigned to the airplane based on how you did in the class and your preferences. And then after that, you do top-off training that is more airframe specific. So for the fighter guys, you do some make-believe air-to-air intercepts in the sim. For maybe some of the EWO guys, you get back into the beeps and squeaks and identifying all the stuff that they do. So that happened. Now, from what I've heard, I think they do a track select right now, to where halfway through the program you kind of decide, or they kind of decide whether you want to go on a strike track maybe for like fighters and bombers, or I forget. They kind of divide it up into tracks, and then you get a little bit more specialized. And then once you go down that road for a while, and you get more skills that are adaptable to fighters or bombers, then that's when you get into airframe specific choices. Prior to your drop night there, whether you're going to go Strike Eagle or B1 or B-52 or whatever. So hopefully that, and as far as like actually getting a CSO versus a pilot slot, that is totally depends on what commissioning source that you go through. So I went through OTS, and I think on my initial board, there was like 9 pilot slots out of 1,100 applicants. 100 of those applicants got picked up, and there was like 40 CSO slots, I think. So now each year, depending on what board you're on, it could be, 40 pilot slots and 9 CSO slots or something. Who knows? But so they normally rack and stack what they think that your application, is going to be best for whatever it is. And I don't really know how they do that. A couple of us were scratching our heads because they put a lot of guys who are professional pilots who had really good PICSUM and AFOQT scores into CSO slots, and then they put a lot of people into pilot slots that had no previous flying experience and had marginal PICSUM and AFOQT pilot scores, and then they went on to pilot training. Some of them washed out at what we had was initial flight screening while we were there, and decided that, and they hadn't flown before. IFS was the first time that they flew. They decided flying wasn't for them, and then the Air Force wasted a pilot slot on someone who resigned before they even started pilot training. And on the other hand, you had a bunch of guys who took CSO slots, but they would rather have a pilot slot, or they were, previously a professional pilot before, but they couldn't slide into that pilot slot. So because they were committed to the CSO slot. So I don't really know what kind of magic goes on behind closed doors about how they rack and stack people, or who does it, or who's familiar with what program, or what attributes that they say, hey, he's going to go to a nav, or he's going to go to a pilot. Once you get into ROTC in the academy, I think it's a lot more about, they have a lot more pilot slots available. So pretty much, if you qualify for it, then you can get it, with certain exceptions. And then some people who are medically not qualified to be a pilot will go the CSO road. So what I've seen, at least, is from the ROTC and academy perspective, is that a lot of people who go to CSO school that are from those commissioning pipelines are usually because they couldn't get a medical waiver in either on time, or they just couldn't, or they got denied a medical waiver, or something precluded them from being otherwise qualified for that slot. Every once in a while, you meet somebody who that was their first choice because that's what they wanted to do for a while. But those are usually kind of rare within the field to see.
Last question then, for you, same person asking. Just any advice that you would give to anybody wanting to get into the Strike Eagle community? It sounds like he or she may have a UPT or sort of a UCT option available to them, but they're just asking any particular advice. Yeah. So sorry, this person actually says, so J Lorian 21 says, I'm in my first year of AFROTC. Any advice for them to get into the strike?
Yeah, I would say that I think that if you're in your first year of RTC, I would probably spend time sowing the right seeds for the future, as far as because between ROTC and between OTS and the academy and stuff, there's a certain amount of Kool-Aid that you're going to have to drink when it comes to playing by the rules and being part of the team, and buying a lot of the process about how everything happens, and being being in on all that. What I would say is try to do your absolute best at everything you can on your end, and make sure that all of your school grades are, get A's in every class that you possibly can. Help out everybody else, and become a well-liked individual within your RTC unit, and work hard to all the little things that you can, and develop great relationships with people, and don't discount people because they think, or you think that they might not be able to help you get to your goal. I would say that try to just develop great relationships with everybody. Be as likable as you can, get as good grades as you can, and then what you'll do is, especially when it comes to like the AFOQT or any of the standardized testing, just try to get the best scores that you can and find a way. And with like the TBAS, and then with the PIXM score, I think it's what pilot candidate selection method or something like that, that takes a portion of your flight hours. Just try to figure out a way to get flight hours for cheap if you're not already flying. There's multiple ways, whether it's through Civil Air Patrol is one of those ways. Another way is just washing airplanes at the airport and bumming flight time with the CFI, who's on the airfield or something like that. And anyways, a lot of those things will start to pay off later on. And as the Air Force goes through changes, whether it's it kind of ebbs and flows on if they're going to take a lot of pilots one year, or they're going to take a lot of CSOs the next year. They're going to tone down the amount of aircrew that they take overall, or the amount of fighter slots are going to go down. Every advantage that you can give yourself when times get tough is going to pay off enormously. And it may seem like getting working hard to get an A in a class that you don't really like that much may seem very pedantic. Eventually, that's going to be another feather in your hat when things get tough, and somebody's going to choose you over the next guy. Hopefully, for whatever reason. And then once you get to pilot training, I would say that I would make it. I wouldn't be over the top, but I would definitely keep your focus on, going to fighters. If that's what you want to do, keep your focus on that, and just realize that a lot of the pain in UPT or UCT is very, very temporary, and you just have to kind of nod, smile, and get through it. And then you'll poke fun at everybody once you graduate, and then you'll remember some of your asshole instructors, and they'll still be assholes, later on. And then you'll kind of look back on it, and either you'll appreciate what they taught you, or you'll appreciate the fact that you'll never be like they'll be. You know what I mean? Or you'll make it your life's goal never to, when you become an instructor, not to be like them. Real quick, I remember when I was at UPT, I flew a ride with this Dutch major who had a reputation that he's the hardest possible guy to fly with. He always gets in your head and always makes you second guess every decision that you ever made. And he's super sarcastic, and you never knew if you passed the ride or if you failed the ride. And he had a reputation for hooking way more students than he passed, and just if you saw your name on the schedule with him, you're just like contemplate another airframe, or think that maybe you're going to go fly a heavy or something, or that's it, or you're done. And I remember I flew with him, and I flew a very stressful ride with them. It turned into 2 rides, because it's what we call an out and back in a T-38, and it was a very important instrument ride. And he did that. He was in my head the whole entire time. He was making me second guess every decision. I was just, every time I would do something, he'd say, "Oh, you sure about that?" And you thought you were doing something wrong. And anyways, I was very frustrated with him the whole entire time. And then now in hindsight, I said, you know what? Like, the stuff that he did there really prepared me for how to deal with real life distractions, and when trying to get your focus back. And then ultimately, it was really good. And I look back on, like, it was just such a positive thing to fly with that guy, even though he was the hardest, the meanest instructor to fly with. It seemed to work out just fine. So when you come up to somebody like that, I would say just take it in stride, and just take notes for the future. And one day you'll look back and you'll say that, hey man, if I had a real shitty instructor in ROTC who was giving me a hard time, I either found someone I didn't want to be like, or I found someone who's going to inspire me to do better and push through. So that would be my humble advice.
Stinger, thanks very much. Appreciate it.